Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of What Africans Want. My name is Muloongo Muchelemba, and I am the founder of Ongolo.com, a pan-African website whose main objective is to keep Africans connected and engaged and to promote Africa and Africans. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the leadership race to replace the World Trade Organization Director General. One of the objectives of Ongolo is to promote Africans into leadership roles on the global stage, because that is the only way we will get our voices heard. So I was very intrigued by this race with 8 candidates vying to replace the Brazilian current Director General. And we have 3 Africans from North, East, and West, no one from Southern Africa, which was very interesting. But we've got 3 candidates who've thrown their hats in the ring to replace someone at an institution that has one of the biggest impacts on Africa's development. So I thought it would be great to have a quick discussion with people online about this and also explore what our chances are of actually getting this role. So I'll start by giving you a quick overview of what WTO actually does. Okay. So WTO, founded back in 1995. I think I went to university in 1996 and we were learning all about GATT, which preceded WTO. And the mandate of WTO is to manage the rules of international trade and ensure the fair and equitable treatment of all its members through negotiations and trade dispute settlements. Now, even though I've only highlighted rules on this page, I really need you to keep in mind as we go through the conversation, rules, negotiation, and trade dispute settlement, because those 3 components will help us understand, first of all, why there's a vacancy right now, a year early, and also the challenges that will face the person that does replace Roberto Azevedo. So that's an overview of WTO. Also thought it would be useful to share with you information on which countries in Africa are not members of WTO, because I thought that every country in the world was a member of WTO, but apparently it's not mandatory. So when you think about it, we've got about 199 or close to 200 countries in the world. About 36 of them are not members of WTO. And in Africa, those countries include Algeria, Comoros, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ethiopia twice, apologies. Libya, Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And it's worth pointing out that both Algeria and Sudan have been trying to get into WTO. I think Sudan had to resolve issues, legacy issues around sanctions, whereas Algeria's trade regime just did not meet the WTO requirements, and they've been working on that. And these are 2 really big economies for Africa and will be a game changer. The flip side of that is Ethiopia is fast emerging as one of the biggest markets in Africa, and it is not a member of WTO. And in fact, just the other day, I had a conversation with somebody who said that Ethiopia was perhaps able to get a better deal with China because they're not a member of WTO. So I think the debate about WTO and whether it's worth it will increase over the next couple of years as the fallout from Donald Trump continues. And there'll be more on that when I talk about why the current Director General resigned. Okay, so let's talk about what WTO actually does, because that's also really important. Okay, so I've got a slide up here that I'm going to put up and I will go off camera. So the role of WTO has 5 essential key deliverables. The first one is around trade negotiations, and they basically help to draft or help countries draft agreements that cover all goods, services, and intellectual property. Now, this point is really important, and people need to realize that what WTO does affects everything we do. So the groceries that you buy in the supermarket, the clothes that you're wearing, the TV programs that you watch on DSTV, if you're watching out of Africa, and how you do, your trade, how you import goods online, all of that is governed by WTO. So I cannot stress enough how important this body is and why it's important for Africans to appreciate the fight for us to actually be the head of this organization, because that is the only way we'll be able to get a say in how some of these rules are dictated about intellectual property, for example. So if you saw the last interview I did with Afronomics Law, they were very good at articulating exactly what rules disenfranchise African countries because of the way they've been structured by WTO. So we really need to have a voice there. So Director General is a great place to start because people will hear you if you shout from the mountaintop. And so I'm really keen to see one of the three candidates that we have actually succeed this role. The second thing that WTO does is they do implementation and monitoring. So trade agreements are public. And this is why you see Donald Trump fighting with China in the public domain. And before that, he went after Canada, he went after Latin America, he went after Europe. And if you remember on the first slide, WTO is about implementing rules. So what Trump has done essentially is thrown out the rule book. Now, if one country goes rogue, that actually really undermines what WTO is about. And that is why this implementation and monitoring component is very important. And it leads to the third point, which is around dispute settlement. So WTO arbitrates disputes between countries. So ideally, US-China trade war would have been settled behind closed doors by a bunch of technocrats trying to understand exactly what Donald Trump had, his issues with China. But instead, it was played out in the court of public media and public opinion, and it was really tied to Make America Great. And that's not how WTO works. And that's another reason why we're having trouble at the WTO. And the fourth thing that WTO does is it builds trade capacity, especially for developing countries. So we have quite a few people from African countries who are working in Geneva at WTO, and we also see experts coming into our countries to help us build that capacity around trade. And the last aspect, the fifth aspect of WTO's mandate is to have regular dialogue with key stakeholders. So their remit is not just trade, they also look at the impact on, say, development. And this has been one of the criticisms of the institution during COVID because they've been notoriously quiet about their position on this. I don't know if that has changed, but in the summer, beginning of the summer, this was the analysis. The WTO didn't really come out strongly to help the world manage, and then, of course, their boss quit. So we'll actually go into the story of why the current Director General quit his role. So Roberto Azevedo is a Brazilian diplomat who became the head of the Director General of the World Trade Organization about 7 years ago. He's currently in his second term, which was expected to run until September 2021. But he abruptly resigned on the 14th of May this year in a move that caught everyone off guard. So in his statement, official statement, he said that being in lockdown and having knee surgery had given him time to reflect on what he wanted to do in life. And he felt that resigning and allowing the organization to put in place measures for WTO going forward, they have a big conference next year, was really important for them to get a head start on that rather than waiting for him to leave in September, I think, next year. So the backstory to that is, so yes, he resigned, but what people believe is that he's had a really frustrating tenure, especially since Donald Trump became president. So I mentioned earlier that Trump has been ripping out the rule book by going after countries unilaterally and not following the rules of WTO. And what that does, it really undermines the essence of WTO, because if the United States is allowed to dictate its own trade agreements that are not necessarily in line with what the rule book says, then it's really unfair for countries that are towing the line. And it's going to create some serious tension among them. So journalists have been talking about it's now time, do or die for WTO, because its very essence is at risk. And that is why the stakes are very high for the institution as a whole. And they're also really high for Africa, because two of the issues that they want to discuss in the next meeting, which I think is now going to be in 2021, are around e-commerce, which is doing business online, and also around the special preferential treatment that developing countries have. And so if we do not have a say in how those things evolve, we will find our developmental agenda set back many decades, and we're already behind. And so replacing Roberto Azevedo is quite key. And you do have some sympathy for why he would resign if he cannot do his core job. The other core thing that they could not do, in addition to trade negotiations being done outside of the WTO rules, was that trade disputes is a very important aspect of what WTO does. And so there's a court, an appellate body that actually decides and arbitrates on cases. And two of the judges, I believe, resigned, and the US has been blocking replacing those judges. And the reason the United States has so much sway is because they are the biggest budget contributor. And so there's been paralysis in WTO for much of the last year. I think they've put temporary measures to keep the wheels turning. But currently, two of their core responsibilities, trade negotiations and trade disputes, are really under threat thanks to one person, which is quite frustrating. And so the context for this is, if the Brazilian, who didn't have the connectivity managing the United States, China, and European Union, is quitting, then you can imagine the uphill battle that whoever replaces him will be up against. But like I say, the stakes are high for Africa. We need to make sure that the little that we have is protected. And one way to do that is to ensure that we actually have an African candidate replacing a Brazilian, even though the job is quite painful. And hopefully November will go the way of the world and we will see the last of Trump. But, you know, you never know. So let's just try and see what we can do to get our people in the job. So I'm going to just now actually talk about the candidates because we have three candidates, and there's a backstory to this. So originally, the African Union had tried to negotiate with different African countries to only field one candidate, because there are currently 8 candidates, and you've got candidates from the UK. So Liam Fox, who was a minister, is one of the candidates, though he's not particularly strong because he didn't perform well in Brexit. You have a candidate from South Korea, someone from Moldova, someone from Mexico, and the current or the former finance minister of Saudi Arabia as well. So you've got 5 other candidates. And so what happens is, if your countries and regions do not come in united, you're basically splitting the vote among the candidates. So the AU had done a lot of lobbying behind the scene. And at one point we had a lot of candidates. So we had someone from Benin who dropped out following the discussions with the AU. And then at some point we had only 2 candidates from Africa, so Egypt and Nigeria. And then at the last minute, Kenya fielded their candidate, who had long been rumored to be standing. So we, as Africa, are not necessarily united on this, which is a real chances of actually succeeding in this role. So let me start with Ngozi, who is probably the most well-known of the 3 candidates. Actually, Amina is also just as well known, but let me start with Ngozi. So Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, I'm so sorry, I didn't pronounce that right. Iweala is one of the candidates and one of the front runners actually for this role. Now, her background is that she worked for the World Bank for 25 years. And her last role was a managing director in operations, where she managed a budget of $81 billion. She's also known as being a past finance minister of Nigeria. And she did that role for 7 years and 2 stints. And she currently sits on the boards of Standard Chartered and Twitter. I should say that I work there, but I'm not putting any bias in what I'm saying because Ngozi sits on our board. But she sits with Standard Chartered. She sits on the board of Standard Chartered and Twitter. And she's also a special envoy for African Union and WTO. And of all the candidates, people say that she's probably the most famous, probably because Nigeria is one of the biggest countries in Africa. But she has a strong chance of actually succeeding in the role. I think her pros is that she has connectivity in the IMF and Washington, having worked, the World Bank, having worked in Washington for so long. So she has that connectivity with one of the key stakeholders for WTO. But her main disadvantage is she actually hasn't worked in WTO. And that is what the other 2 candidates actually have over her. So we will see. Let's talk about Dr. Amina Mohammed, who has been a cabinet minister in Kenya. She's held various roles. She's also worked for the UN as an assistant secretary general, and she's worked in the environmental agency as well as a deputy ED. She's got really strong experience as a politician, but also as a technocrat. So she also served as a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Justice. And her WTO credentials are that she was Kenya's permanent representative and ambassador to the WTO for I think 5 or 6 years. And when she was cabinet minister in charge of international trade, she actually chaired I think 2 WTO events. So she has a lot of experience in WTO, and she's also a politician. And given the reasons and the circumstances that Robert Azevedo resigned, you need someone who actually is comfortable and able to manage the politics. So some analysts have both Amina and Ngozi at par in this race. So it'd be really good to see which one of the two emerges. So not to slight our Egyptian candidate, because I actually quite liked his profile. So AbdelHamid Mamdouh. I'm not doing really well today with pronunciations. Apologies, everyone. He has worked for WTO for probably about 30 years, if you add his time at GATT, which preceded that. So he started his career working in diplomatic service in Egypt and has always focused on trade. And then he worked for, I think, preceding GATT or adjacent to GATT, and then joined WTO, where he was a trade services negotiator and apparently one of the leading ones. And he's currently working as a visiting industry professor at the University of London. So I guess his strength is that he knows WTO inside out. He has written the rules. So if there's anyone who knows what can be done, I think of the 3 candidates, when it comes to driving policy and actually understanding where the gaps are for Africa, I think he's probably the strongest one from a technical skills perspective, but he's also the weakest when it comes to being a politician. And the fact that he worked in the system for a long time means that he may be seen as a technocrat rather than a strong player. And so I think that's what's going against him. And the reason we say that is one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about Robert Azevedo is that people need to understand the role of the WTO Director General. And a Financial Times journalist described it as a role of a butler. He said that your role is to organize events and bring people together. It's not really to get people to do what you say they should do. And you always have to manage the 3 main blocks of the United States, the EU, and China. So it's quite a frustrating role, but at the same time, it's a high impact role, and it will definitely serve a candidate who has the willingness to deliver. Because one of the criticisms of Robert Azevedo is that he didn't really have a tangible trade regime win during his time as the Director General. And that is what people assess your legacy by. And so it'd be really interesting to see if Africa does get this and beats out the UK, Moldova, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico. It'll be interesting to see what we can actually do and what we can actually do for Africa. And so that is one thing I wanted to flag. And in terms of the timelines, candidates are currently meeting the council and member states. So there's a bit of lobbying and posturing, very similar to an actual political campaign, and actually articulating what they want to achieve if they are selected as Director General. And this will continue until the 7th of September. So we won't probably have somebody in place until Q4 2020. And of course, the United States can veto a candidate. So we don't know how this is going to play out, but the reason I'm flagging this is it would be great for Africans to actually understand what is going on and why we need to have somebody here, because who knows, you might have influence, you might have a friend who knows a friend who knows a friend who's actually voting. And I think we just need to make noise and make sure that we have African leading world organizations. So it's great to see Dr. Tedros at WHO, and it's great to see Winnie as well at UNAIDS. And we need to see more African faces from South, East, West, or North Africa leading global institutions and really pushing Africa's agenda. So that was my take for today. It was a very short session. It's just flagging this because the candidates are actually canvassing currently. So if you're really interested in this, please go to WTO website and you can read their bios and then keep following the progress on this. And I will come back and report on this once we actually have a Director General nominated. So that is it for me. It was going to be a very short 15 to 20 minute blast on, hey guys, keep an eye on the WTO Director General race, and let's just hope that Africa actually emerges victorious. So that is it for me. I'm going to be doing a lot of short sessions going forward just to flag topical issues. But if you have any comments, any feedback, please post on the Facebook wall, and I'll pick those up after the interview. But for everyone who tuned in, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.